Once again, we're back in the good old days, the meat and potatoes of the channel, if you will. It's ProRes, it's All Japan, it's the 1980s, and it's a foreign legend. What more do you need? Anyway, I'm yet to really do a vid that centres around Bruiser Brody, one of the most important foreign talents in Puro history, monstrously over with the crowds in Japan, more so than he was anywhere else. Not to say that Brody wasn't a big deal elsewhere, because he most certainly was. However, his frequent disagreements with promoters over the years meant that Brody didn't really have somewhere you would call a base, where he was solid. He would appear somewhere for a little while, raise absolute hell, and then he'd be on his way to the next adventure. Maybe he'd come back, maybe he wouldn't. Still, even if Brody was the archetypal wrestling drifter, All Japan would be the closest thing that he had to a home. It's where a big chunk of his most famous bouts happen, where he had his most famous team, where he had his strongest relationship with a promoter, and so forth. And still, even that was prone to fracture at points. Covering all of Bruiser Brody's All Japan years would be quite an undertaking indeed, but I am instead focusing on something specific. His last run in All Japan, from late 1987 to the spring of 1988. It may be only a few months, but it contains several of his finest moments, it's another important building block for King's Road, and it helped re-establish Brody as one of All Japan's most fearsome talents. Presumably, this one would have been longer, if it weren't for the fateful events of the 16th of July. We leave that aside for now, however, to put the scope on the intelligent monster, and his return to the place where he was an undisputed icon. We speak about Bruiser Brody's return to All Japan, of course, but that begs the question, why did he leave in the first place? Brody caught fire in All Japan almost as soon as he first got there in 1979. He was, for the first half of the 1980s, undoubtedly the most popular foreign wrestler in All Japan, if not in the country as a whole. He had the look, the charisma, and the aura all down pat. He could talk a good game, he paired well with the native aces. It was a perfect match. As All Japan slowly gained on New Japan through the first half of this decade, Brody's popularity would only increase, especially as he teamed up with Stan Hansen, a duo that was, well, virtually invincible. Of course, being invincible was a pretty big part of the deal with Brody. The man basically never jobbed, and this was often a big reason why he tended to fall out with promoters. The man protected his image at all costs. He would basically never agree to lose, just in case those losses got back to Japan and damaged his reputation there. Also, his preferred schedule fit nicely around All Japan's tours. Brody was never one to work a full schedule, as he was a family man at heart. Indeed, being able to spend time with his family was perhaps the biggest reason why he was so independent. And so, Japan was unquestionably his priority. The bigger he got in All Japan, the harder he became to deal with for the NWA and the like, and the less available he became, much to the chagrin of promoters. This is also a big reason why he never made any deal with Vince McMahon. Such things were talked about, possibly even negotiated, but never came to anything. He treasured his independence over any kind of WWF contract. Still, in 1985, Brody felt that his position as the top foreign dog in All Japan was threatened a little. This wasn't necessarily a threat from Stan Hansen. He'd known and worked with the Lariat for a long time, but now there were other forces in play, such as the arrival in All Japan of the all-conquering Road Warriors, and in particular the arrival of Riki Chozu's Isshin Ganami, lured away from New Japan. This was a major moment in the never-ending struggle between Bubba and Inoki. The arrival of Riki Choshu was enough for All Japan to take over as the country's top promotion, and Inoki naturally looked for a way to strike back. Ultimately, that was Brody. In March of 1985, Inoki signed him for what was, at the time, a phenomenally large 3-year contract. Brody would be getting paid in the region of $250,000 per year for 16 weeks of work, as well as a huge 6-figure bonus just for signing the contract. While all of this sounds good, it soon became clear that Bruiser Brody and New Japan were going to be a bad match, for reasons that should be obvious in retrospect. Naturally, Brody was going to immediately be feuding with Antonio Inoki and, well, as I've already mentioned, Brody didn't like to lose. Neither did Inoki. We're talking about two guys who would literally go years in between jobs, so how do you think this is going to play out? Brody and Inoki brought the absolute best out of each other in Lurin, but the fans soon grew frustrated with the feud as it became clear that neither Brody or Inoki were willing to job for the other. The matches may have been great, but they never had a clean finish. Brody found himself frustrated with New Japan's organisation, then enraged by the company digging their heels on paying a finder's fee that was promised to him for bringing Kerry Von Erich into New Japan, and it all came to a head on December 11th, 1985 when Brody shot on Seiji Sakaguchi in Lurin. This was in the middle of the IWGP Tag League, and it resulted in Brody and his partner, Jimmy Snuka, walking out of the company. While Brody did end up wrestling a couple more matches for New Japan in '86 against Inoki and Tatsumi Fujinami, money disputes reared their head again almost immediately, and that was enough for Brody and New Japan to fall out for good. Brody would come to regard his deal with New Japan as the single biggest mistake of his career, and it's fair to say that he wondered if he'd be able to fix it. His bridge with New Japan was thoroughly burned, and it was unclear whether he'd be able to repair his bridge with All Japan. However, on October 1987, he was brought back in. Baba turned to Brody, still one of the most popular foreign talents amongst the fans, regardless of all that had happened, after Ric Flair cancelled a tour at the last minute. And all that, of course, leads to his big All Japan return. He comes back just in time for the Real World Tag League, where he'll be teaming with Snuka. While Snuka had previously won the tournament with Brody in 1981, he was actually a very late replacement for Colonel De Beers, who was initially supposed to team with Brody. A lot of this detail comes from the obituary that was written for Bruiser Brody by big old Dave Meltzer, dated August 1st, 1988, perhaps one of the first really big and quite extensive Meltzer obituaries. There are some rather complex and grey areas to the man's legacy, and to actually watch Bruiser Brody wrestle is to see someone who can at times be a little Marmite. He has this incredible presence in the ring, but sometimes his matches can be marred a little by him almost never looking weak. As unstable as he may appear in action, Brody is never not in complete control of his gimmick, sometimes to a degree that can be irritatingly obvious, especially when it comes to the finishes of matches. A large part of his legacy amongst wrestlers is down to that fierce independence. A man who always stood up for himself, was never afraid to tell a promoter to piss off, and taught other wrestlers how to fight their corner. The King of the Indies, only from a time long before most people had a firm grasp of what indie wrestling was and how successful people could be on the indie circuits. A freelancer who absolutely knew his worth. You can understand why quite a lot of promoters ended up falling out with him, seeing as how working with Brody was a rare instance where usually they didn't hold all the cards. The people demanded him, the magazines and nascent dirt sheets lionised him. It's commonly known that Brody himself was a big early source for Meltzer, and he was close to plenty other journalists, which makes a lot of sense considering that his degree was in journalism and he was a sports writer before he entered the wrestling world. In Japan, he was very close to the legendary journalist and wrestling historian Fumi Saito, who even recorded what was basically a proto-shoot interview with Brody in 1985, although it wasn't released to the public for 30 years. That's not the only shoot interview that Brody conducted either. Here's one on video from 1987, speaking softly, talking business, using his real name and so on. It is funny some of the little things that connect back to him, such as, say, him being the original Ribera Steakhouse guy. He wanted a good steak in Tokyo, he found a hole-in-the-wall spot in the Gatunda district, enjoyed it, came back with all his wrestler friends, and the rest was history. You can see how in many ways Brody was so ahead of his time when it came to promoting himself as a wrestler. And the man would carry all of that swagger with him, of someone who could never be fully controlled by anyone. The intelligent monster gimmick was something that he lived by. The whirling dervish in the arena provides the perfect allegory for Brody's own dealings with promoters. Most folks, including those who aren't the biggest fans of Brody's style, would agree that All Japan is where you see the man at his best. And now it's time to examine some matches from this final run. I have got 5 in particular that I have singled out, and they're all quite important in their own way. A good place to start would be with his first match in the 1987 Tag League as, hoo boy, it is quite a quartet, a genuine slobber knocker, as good old JR would put it. Brody's up against his old partner. Brody and Snuka versus Stan Hansen and the Lariat's own new partner, Terry Bam Bam Gordy. There's threads here that go back quite a few years to one of All Japan's most famous moments, when Brody and Snuka won the Tag League in 1981 by beating the Funks, with Hansen himself jumping ship from New Japan, making a shocking debut in their corner, and his Western Lariat helping to secure the victory. Now, Brody and Hansen are on opposite sides, something that, aside from the very early days of both their careers, simply hasn't happened before. This is as dreamy a dream match as it gets, and we shouldn't waste any time getting into it. It's not like they're going to wait after all. This match is, well, it's okay, basically. It gets a bonus for being at the Korakuen Hall. As much as the crowds were surely going to be shouting anyway, it's always better in Korakuen. The parts where Brody and Hansen go at it are obviously the most interesting. They quickly try to throw some of their biggest bombs at each other, and even if they never fully connect, it certainly gets the crowd going. They definitely perform well. Hansen is Hansen and basically doesn't put a foot wrong. Brody has the crowd behind him, hussing all away and throwing whopping big boots, and Gordy is definitely in there with the odd nasty move and strike. Unsurprisingly, the main thing that drags this match down is Snuka. He still manages to get most of his moves in, but in 1987 the 44-year-old Snuka is already at a stage where he's slowing up pretty quickly, and he is rather gassed by the end of this, which is unfortunate seeing as he's in the ring for the majority of the bout. You do get a pretty ugly body attack from him near the end, which sorta sums up his state. The match never really explodes into the brawl from hell that you may have expected, perhaps understandable seeing as it's very early days in the tournament, although you might think that actually there should have been more big outside brawling sections. Of course, that is where the match inevitably ends up. It should be pretty clear that with these two teams involved, the end result is going to be a double countout. It's a kind of lame one, to be honest. It basically involves Brody and Hansen clawing at each other, Gordy trying to stop Brody and Snuka from pulling Hansen out of the ring, and not quite managing it. In the end, the honours and points are shared at 17 minutes 14, Brody does more popping off the crowd by getting a Monslem, and that's about it. Is this match worth seeking out? Perhaps not. It's a pretty average real-world tag league bout in the end. Still, it is historically significant, the first and only time that a prime and all-conquering Brody and Hansen went against each other, and indeed, the last time that they would share a ring. From there, the tag league proceeds pretty well for Brody and Snuka. Aside from a DQ loss against the Funks in a typically bloody rematch of the 1981 final, they defeat just about every team aside from going to 2 double countouts with the Revolution team of Ashura Hara and Genichiro Tenryu, as well as against Giant Baba and Hiroshi Wajima, and Olympics, Jumbo Tsuruta and Yoshiaki Yatsu. There is one historically curious moment that unfortunately we cannot see. On the 6th of December, Brody and Snuka defeated the team of Shinichi Nakano and Tiger Mask, marking one of the very few times that Brody shared a ring with Mitsuharu Misawa. They did go at it a couple of times when Brody returned in October in 6-man tag bouts, one of which was shown on All Japan TV. Going into the final night, they're leading the table on 14 points, while Revolution, Gordy Hansen and Olympics are on 13. A crucial victory for Brody and Snuka in their second match against Baba and Wajima on December 10th ultimately means that the tournament will be decided by the last match between Brody Snuka and Olympics on December 11th at the Budokan, with Revolution and Hansen Gordy both taken out of the running after they go to a double countout on the last night, meaning that they both finished on 14 alongside the Funks, who won their last match against the Youngbloods. Another double count-out would work just fine for Brody and Snuka in this instance, giving them the single point they need for victory, while Olympics need to win in order to leapfrog them. This final ends up being good. Definitely far from the best Tag League finals, but a decent enough watch. Again, as you might expect, the best stuff is always going to come from Brody going against Tsuruta. The pair have a long history together that we'll get into shortly. It is definitely understandable why people can have trouble with watching Bruiser Brody nowadays on the old tapes. He is very much someone of the Territories era in the way he looks, how he moves, and how he wrestles. A lot of the older heads say that you needed to have actually seen him live and in the flesh to really appreciate him, and you may expect someone a bit more vicious and brawling, as opposed to someone who actually tends to ground opponents quite often, being methodical, lording it over them with the occasional big boot or drop kick. Brody never had the sort of subtle evolution and movement with the times in his style that someone like, say, Stan Hansen had. Still, he is undoubtedly a fine watch here. Indeed, another part of why this last All Japan run might be the very best Brody to watch is because he's a little bit of an anachronism, coming in right at the stage when the company is slowly starting to piece together Kin's Road, and that anachronism provides a neat contrast. You see his absolute command over the crowd, he's got those adoring fans on a string, he sets the pace, and does the odd bit of nastiness. A vicious as hell stalling piledriver on Jumbo comes very close to getting the win. I should say that Snuka fares better here too. This might be one of his last actually good performances. He's not really on the level of the others, but he is going as fast as he can. He even breaks out a frickin' springboard splash of sorts, which is not something I expected from the 44-year-old jacked and utterly knackered Superfly. Yoshiaki Yatsu, who, believe it or not, is a 31-year-old man here, does perfectly fine, brawls and works nicely without ever doing too much of note, but he has his role, and he hits a couple of big suplexes. A thing that drags the bout down is that the ending is a little silly. Tsuruta briefly gets taken out of commission, and Brody and Snuka look for something nasty. Snuka holds Yatsu, and Brody boots him straight into a vicious suplex. However, Yatsu rolls for it, traps Snuka, and gets the pin in 16:51 to win the Tag League for Olympics, much to Brody and Snuka's consternation. Under the watchful eyes of the rest of the Tag League participants, and a memorial for the tragically lost Kazuharu Sonoda and his wife, who were sadly killed in the South African Airways Flight 295 plane crash during this tour, Olympics prevail, with Jumbo Tsuruta winning his fifth and final real-world Tag League crown, having previously won it twice with both Giant Baba and Genichiro Tenryu. The 5 Tag Leagues is a record that Jumbo still holds to this day, shared with Kenta Kobashi. Brody doesn't appear on All Japan's first tour of 1988, instead working in and around both Capital Wrestling and Southern Championship Wrestling, but he returns in March for the Champion Carnival Tour, which at this stage was a regular tour and didn't consist of a singles league. This would be Brody's final go-around with All Japan, with 23 shows happening over the course of a month, and it is certainly filled with events. The majority of the tour will see him in tag or 6-man action, teaming with Snuka and Big Bubba, Big Boss Man, and this includes the only meetings between Brody and future pillar Akira Taue. This carnival, as opposed to simply ending with a big show at the Budokan, goes all around the country, with the big venues evenly spread through the tour. The 27th March Tokyo Budokan show takes place on the second night, and it's main evented by Brody going against Jumbo Tsuruta, with Jumbo's NWA International Heavyweight title on the line. This is, of course, far from their first rodeo. The pair have fought regularly since 1979, and there's been some big matches along the way. One thing that is notable, really, is that to date basically none of their singles bouts have resulted in any kind of clean finish. It's always ended in some sort of disqualification, a double countout, a no contest. That's the way Finns usually panned out earlier in the decade, with the closest Finn to a clean finish being the match that was possibly their greatest, the August 31st 1983 bout where Jumbo outsmarted Brody to win by countout and claim the NWA International title, and with it, the recognition of being All Japan's top ace. However, it's 1988, people are tired of that sort of schmoz finish, and with Jumbo's big belt on the line, well, we may see something different. Initially, Jumbo largely dominates this match. It's not often that we see Brody working from under like this, but this is Tsuruta at his peak. He's just as powerful as Brody, he's quicker, he has the technical advantage, and by now Jumbo has his own vicious streak, something that he developed more over his heated contests against the likes of Choshu and the Ishinganami in the middle of the decade. In 1988, he is arguably the most complete pro wrestler to ever walk the earth. He takes Brody down with relative ease, repeatedly grinding out a side headlock, with Brody only ever able to get the odd shot in. They are telling when he does, whether it's a big chop, a dropkick or a power slam, but it's never too long before Jumbo regains control. His own strikes are enough to send Brody reeling, and he's also got 5 years on the intelligent monster. That makes a big difference in wrestling, with the 41-year-old Brody perhaps not being quite as fast and as dynamic as he was back in 1983. What we see isn't necessarily exciting as such, but it grips you. Tsuruta is now the long-established ace of the company, and he is doing exactly what a champion should do. This is the slow, brutal grind that he learnt from the Funks, from Briscoe, from Bockwinkel, and many more. Over half of the match goes by before Brody gets any kind of foothold in it, powering through the chops, hitting some of his own, finally getting the boot up in the corner and dropping the big leg. Suddenly Brody is getting big moves in, hitting hard, but then, in the words of Roddy Piper, just when Brody thinks he's got the answers, Jumbo changes the questions. What happens when Jumbo retorts with his knee butt? Suddenly, he's the one who takes Brody to the outside. He's the one smashing Brody into the ring post, sending him reeling over the guardrail. This is the newfound absolute ruthlessness, something that Brody has never had to deal with from Jumbo before. This is what Brody does to people, not the other way around. Previously, he had to deal with the perfect ace. Now, he also has to deal with Kaibutsu Tsuruta. The man has a monster of his own. Jumbo pummels Brody with enzuigiris back in the ring, the eyes almost rolling back into Bruiser's head before he falls, and suddenly it's hard to see a way back for him. Jumbo by now is simply too complete a wrestler for Brody to deal with. He doesn't know where the next attack's coming from or what it's going to be. Even when he does manage to get Jumbo to the outside and run his back into the post, it almost feels like a way for Brody to get some respite more than anything. Still, now Brody is pulling up the mat. He may be the underdog right now, but surely he is not going to be beaten at his own game. He tries desperately for a pile driver to the concrete, but he can't manage it, and instead he gets a back body drop for his trouble. Nothing is going his way, as another knee butt sends him crashing to the floor. Again, this is what Brody has done to people all over his career, and now it's looking like Jumbo is going to break him, leave him splayed out on the floor to lose by countout. Jumbo hits the pile driver on the concrete, and surely there's no way back now. And yet, something in Jumbo makes him throw Brody back into the ring, even if it is very likely at this point that he wouldn't have been able to answer the 20 count. And even if he doesn't know it, this will prove to be his one major mistake. Brody just about kicks out after a suplex, and then once again after the signature Texas suplex, Jumbo now building up to the backdrop and finishing in a more traditional way. He tries to take Brody's head off with a lariat, but Brody's able to duck and hit a huge body press for a near fall. Brody is not there yet. He still has to power out after a pile driver, and is fortunate when Tsuruta hits the usually lethal backdrop that he is able to get a foot on the ropes. Tsuruta goes for another favourite, the Fez press. However, he gets caught and he gets hot-shotted. The top rope utterly wrecks him, and all of a sudden the moment is at hand. Brody stalks around, goes to the corner, runs in and hits the King Kong knee drop. At 17:07, Bruiser Brody has pinned Jumbo Tsuruta to win the NWA International Heavyweight title. In a rarity for the intelligent monster, he had to do it in a match where he was dominated virtually throughout, but he somehow managed to find a way, something that perhaps wouldn't have happened if Jumbo had decided that he wasn't going to beat Brody at his own game. I'm also going to credit a little observation from the great Kinch Stalker, one that's again about story threads that go back a long way. The hot shot is a particularly unkind move to Jumbo Tsuruta. He lost the decisive third fall to Terry Funk in his 1976 NWA title shot for a hot shot. A hot shot led to the body press from Rick Martel that lost Jumbo the AWA title in 1984, and another one gave Tenryu the decisive advantage in their June 89 Triple Crown match. I'd go one further and add that the legendary June 8, 1990 match between Jumbo and Mitsuharu Misawa, one of the most important matches in All Japan history, was also basically decided by another bad trip to the ropes that poleaxed him. If you want to have any kind of chance against the perfect ace, those ropes may well have to come into play at some point. With all that said, the post-match here, well, that's quite something to behold. With the fans roaring and chanting Bruiser Brody's name, the confetti coming down, Joe Higuchi raising his hand and Lord James Blears handing him the belt, the character breaks. Bruiser Brody's eyes fill with tears. He embraces the official who hands him the trophy, plants kisses on Blears' cheeks, and openly shows his emotion as he goes to be among his adoring crowd. Brody's not in Lamaya whirling a chain around, he's showing his huge appreciation for the fans who love him. There was a lot of struggle to get to this moment. The disastrous trip to New Japan, the fear that he'd cut himself off from the one promotion that was the closest thing to a home. But now he is back on top, and it's enough to overcome him. For a brief moment, while we're seeing Bruiser Brody out here, we're also seeing Frank Goodish. It's all quite stirring, a marvellous moment, and a rather heartwarming one. The next few dates of the tour go in the usual fashion. Brody, Snuka and Bubba taking on a whole array of Tsuruta-led teams, going against the likes of Taue, Yatsu, Wajima and John Tenta. It's not too long before he has to defend this international belt, and he does so on the next major spot of the tour, the 4th April 1988 show at the Aichi Prefectural Gymnasium in Nagoya, where he takes on Yoshiaki Yatsu. This rather average match is one where Brody is more typically in control for the most part. Yatsu tries to work him, but he has a weak ankle, something Brody uses to his advantage, and he's soon able to use his own ring work to control Yatsu, pairing that up with nasty chops, a chair on the outside and so forth. Yatsu does eventually rally, playing through the pain, trying to make Brody give up with his signature prison lock, but eventually he is undone by his bad ankle. A knee breaker sends Yatsu to the outside, and while he is able to reverse a whip into the guardrail, Brody counters by back body dropping him over it. Brody gets back into the ring, and Yatsu is unable to get there in time. It's a classic count-out win for Brody in 15:04. An okay enough match, not necessarily one to seek out, and not really one where you would ever think that Yatsu had a chance of defeating the monster. Just not on his level. The next big title match, however, that's another matter entirely. We have something of a unique situation going into Brody's title defence on the 15th of April at the Osaka Prefectural Gymnasium. He's going to be facing Genichiro Tenryu. Tenryu has his own belts to defend. Not only has he been the NWA United National Champion since April of 1986, following victory over Ted DiBiase, he is also the PWF Heavyweight Champion. He won that in March of 1988 after defeating Stan Hansen. All three of All Japan's major singles titles are on the line in this match, and so it's announced that this will be a unification bout. The winner takes all and becomes the holder of All Japan's Triple Crown. The stakes are high, and it's not necessarily about that favours Tenryu. He and Brody don't have the same sort of epic history that Brody and Jumbo have, and all of their previous singles matches have pretty decisively ended in Brody's favour. Still, their last singles meeting was nearly 5 years ago, and Tenryu now, basically the second home ace behind Tsuruta, is an altogether different proposition. Right, so, if I was to pick a single Brody match to show to someone who has never seen him before, it would very likely be this one. Either this, or the aforementioned 1983 bout with Tsuruta. This is arguably his greatest match ever, and one of Tenryu's best too. An absolutely phenomenal bout that is a must-watch all over. With that said, I think one thing that helps it is that it is the most modern feeling of all Brody matches, because in many ways this is a thoroughly new pairing. While Tenryu and Brody did have singles meetings previously, Tenryu wasn't on Brody's level back then, and he was never able to go beyond 10 minutes with the monster. This is different. Tenryu and Brody are now peers. This is their only main event level singles clash, and hoo boy, it definitely fits the bill, seeing as they go at it for 30 minutes. There's not a whole lot of downtime either, not too many points where there isn't something happening, a match where even in the slower moments there is still a sense of progression, a story that's always going on where even the smallest details factor into the bout's finish. In other words, there is a fair bit of proto-Kins Road type stuff going on, the Brody bout that it could be said perhaps fits the best into the style that All Japan would soon be running with. The match breaks up nicely into 3 acts. They start off pretty quickly, and we do get some big bombs thrown. Tenryu's got his enzigiri, Brody's got his chops and kicks. It does become clear in this first act though that Brody has an advantage. When it comes to the big strikes, the chops and drop kick, the leg drop, the suplexes, he can hurt Tenryu quite a lot here, and those thumping King Kong kicks are hard to avoid. And so, around the 10-minute mark, Tenryu changes his strategy and decides to go for the leg, which he does so in brutal fashion, starting off with many nasty low kicks and frequently using a leg lock, which of course is a bit more than just a leg lock. Tenryu is always wrenching the leg, using his knuckles and elbow to dig right into it whenever he can. A rest hold can be so much more in the hands of someone like Tenryu. Even when he gets put down by Brody, he still doesn't let up. He'll be on his knees, throwing chops and gok punches at the leg, attached to it like a rabid dog. And he'll also take Brody to town on the outside. He wraps that leg around a ring post. Brody only gets a couple of brief moments of respite, but Tenryu's attack leaves a major mark, ripping away his biggest weapons. The final act starts when Brody finally manages to power through, fueled by hussers, throwing up a tentative boot, and finally manages to start hitting Tenryu hard again. Still, the legwork isn't forgotten here, with most of Brody's attacks being lariats or body attacks, as he never strays too far away from having to hold onto the ropes. With the centre of the ring up for grabs, Tenryu is able to respond in kind. Lariats, body attacks and enzigiris of his own that send Brody reeling, put him in a daze, and nearly get Tenryu the win, but Brody lands a thoroughly decisive running boot as we get closer to 30 minutes, playing through that pain. A giant swing follows, and Brody hits a whopper of a King Kong knee drop. However, it takes a couple of seconds for him to cover Tenryu, which may just prove crucial. Tenryu kicks out to the roar of the crowd. Brody hits a knee attack, running on adrenaline at this point, and then goes for the super finish, all the way to the top rope. The biggest King Kong knee drop of them all connects, surely finishing Tenryu off. But when Brody tries to get up, he finds that he cannot. The knee drop off the top has finished off his weakened leg for good. He rolls to the outside, as does Tenryu. When they get close again, Tenryu is able to hit a powerbomb on the floor, but it is clear that the pair have nothing whatsoever left to give, and all that remains is for Joe Higuchi to count to 20. The match finishes in a double countout, in 30 minutes flat. There's no big whirling of chains in the crowd or anything. Both Tenryu and Brody have to be helped out of the arena. What a match! I've kept out some details as this is definitely one that you need to see if you haven't, but it's one of All Japan's best bouts of the decade. There is an absolutely huge main event feel here, a match that fits the billing of being one that was for all three big singles belts. However, the formation of the Triple Crown will have to wait. For now, Tenryu and Brody both keep their respective titles. Indeed, it would have to wait just a little bit over a year from this match, finally happening when Jumbo Tsuruta faced Stan Hansen for all three belts on 18th of April 1989. With Jumbo Tsuruta losing his NWA International title so early on in the tour, the natural step is for him to make an attempt at getting it back at the end. And of course, he's going to get that chance. Brody vs Tsuruta has been a theme for the majority of the tour, which has mostly featured the two wrestlers taking the lead in six-man tags, and for most of the tour, it's Brody's team who have won the clashes. It is perhaps not too usual to see so many important title bouts happening in one All Japan tour, but seeing as how this was Brody's first big singles focused tour since his return, it makes sense for him to be utterly all over it, rapidly securing his place back at the very top of All Japan, winning the international belt, defending it 3 times, having a unification match as one of those. It's not as if it takes a whole lot to put Brody back on the summit, considering how over he is with the fans, but Bubba is doing a bit of a speed run with the booking here, and Jumbo Tsuruta is going to get his international title rematch on April 19th. This time the cameras are focused on the Miyagi Prefectural Sports Centre in Sendai, in front of around 3,500 people. It's not usually the sort of venue where you would expect to see such a big title match, but that's exactly what we're getting. And as you may have already guessed, this is going to end up being the very last singles meeting between Bruiser Brody and Jumbo Tsuruta. Indeed, the very last time that they will share a ring. Just who's going to come out on top then, in this last dance? This match plays out quite evenly, for the most part. Brody now has the champion's swagger back, and Jumbo isn't able to dominate him as he did for so much of their previous encounter. One thing that I think is quite noticeable is that largely it stays in the ring. Beyond a couple of moments where it spills outside and Jumbo gets his head planted onto a table or ran into a guardrail, it's never too long before Brody brings it back between the ropes, something which is appreciated by the crowd. Jumbo is occasionally able to bring his technical nous into play, but he never quite gets the chance to perform any extended work on a limb, or do any major damage that would prevent Brody using his biggest weapons, the King Kong kick, the powerful suplex throw, his huge leg drop. And so he has to fight fire with fire, which to be fair he is still able to do, getting his own telling blows in with the big knee butt, a suplex of his own, a thunderous uppercut. Jumbo comes close to the win, particularly after a pile driver for which Brody has to find the ropes with his leg, but from there Brody powers through Jumbo's axe handles, lands chops and hits a vicious power slam. From there he seemingly has a decisive advantage, and Jumbo has to do as he did previously against him. He has to survive against the most powerful moves in the monster's arsenal. A tackle that sends him reeling out of the ring, a big leg drop, a massive lariat after Jumbo misses a flying knee, a stalling pile driver. With every move, Brody inches that little bit closer to what appears to be inevitable victory. However, crucially, Brody misses a King Kong knee drop that would have surely won the match. Jumbo is able to roll out of the ring and buy himself some time. Brody still hurts him on the outside, but again, he's soon rolling him back in and, well, seeing as he already missed the regular knee, he may as well go all out. Brody ascends to the top rope for the big knee drop, but Jumbo hauls himself up with a burst of energy, cuts Brody off, and ends up hitting a massive superplex. And again, suddenly, the moment is at hand. Brody staggers up, Jumbo stalks him, and goes in for the kill. He hits the backdrop, and that's enough. Jumbo Tsuruta reclaims the International Heavyweight title in 20 minutes 38, and he does so by pinning Bruiser Brody. This is quite the rarity, more than worthy of being lifted up to the skies once again. In the last few years, the only person to defeat Brody by pinfall has been Abdullah the Butcher. Moreover, Bruiser Brody has not lost a singles match clean in Japan since 1981. In fact, Brody was only pinned twice in All Japan singles matches before this, both times against Giant Baba. As we mentioned already, he did not like to lose. This is a pretty significant moment then. Jumbo retains his gold, and he does so with a decisive victory against an almost impossible enemy. It's a pretty damn good match too. I would say that the story is stronger in the 27th March bout, but this was more of an even contest. Definitely worth watching. Amazingly, even after all that's happened just on this one tour, there is still actually one more significant match on it involving Bruiser Brody. The final night of the Champion Carnival Tour on 22nd of April in Kanagawa sees him challenging for the tag titles, which are held by Genichiro Tenryu and Asura Revolution. He has an odd partner. You may have expected Jimmy Snuka to appear again, but he is actually joined here by Wildfire Tommy Rich, who'd previously spent most of this carnival run teaming with Austin Idol. This Brody and Rich tag team is very new. They'd first teamed together at the start of March in Southern Championship Wrestling. The match itself is a pretty average one. Again, it's kind of the case where things are obviously a lot more exciting when either Brody or Tenryu are in the ring, especially if they're in together. Honestly, when it's Hara and Rich in the ring, well, your attention may possibly start to drift elsewhere. It's a pretty lame finish too. Ultimately, Tenryu pins Rich after a powerbomb, but you may well think that Brody could have broken up the pin if he'd perhaps been a little bit faster. I mean, come on, he got outpaced here by a frickin' Joe Higuchi 3 count, which is just about the slowest and most dramatic thing in the world. You could braise a pound of beef in the time that it takes Higuchi to counter 3, so this does look kind of silly. Not that it matters too much to Brody, who immediately assaults Tenryu with his chain. It is quite clear that these two still have a whole lot of unfinished business with each other following the war they had over the 3 belts. But of course, this is the last match that Bruiser Brody would ever have in All Japan. He presumably gets on a flight the following day, never to return to his adopted wrestling home. Of course, there were plenty of plans in the works for Bruiser Brody. This whole Champion Carnival tour has been about successfully returning him to the very top of the tree, Baba making up for lost time with his favourite intelligent monster. As you can see already, more business is being set up between him and Tenryu, something to work towards in the future. But Baba had even bigger plans than that in the works. A huge show on August 29th at the Nippon Budokan, one where the fans would have voted on the matches that took place, and one where Baba was pretty well certain of what the main event was going to be. A dream match to end all dream matches, the one that was teased so briefly in the 1987 Tag League. Bruiser Brody versus Stan Hansen. With Brody back in play, this contest was by far the biggest thing that All Japan could put on, and it would surely result in the biggest Budokan show that All Japan had run for several years. And unfortunately, the match never happened. The horrid events of July 16th, 1988 have been gone over many times, of course. The possible grudge that had stewed over several years, the silence in the locker room before the start of the show, the call from Invader number 1, Jose Gonzalez, to have a quiet discussion in the shower, the towel that hid the flash of a blade, the scream behind closed doors, the blood pouring on the shower floor, the ambush that was later controversially judged to be in self-defense, the conspiracy as to who else was in on it, Brody telling one of the people who may well have been in the plot to take care of his family. There's a lot here. He was carried by his longtime friend Tony Atlas to an ambulance that took hours to come and taken to the hospital where, at 4:30 AM on July 17th, Frank Goodish, the legendary Bruiser Brody, passed away from his wounds, one that had severed an artery leading to his heart and another that punctured his liver. There are many articles, videos, books, documentaries covering this horrific occurrence, and I don't intend to go too much further than this except to say that the murder of Bruiser Brody is one of the biggest tragedies to ever befall wrestling. We lost one of the greats, a true independent whose impact goes beyond hussars, fur boots and chains, a man who stood up for himself and would have many others following his example. More than that, a wife and son lost their devoted husband and father, someone who no matter what would take the time to call every night that he was on the road, and the people who were the biggest reason why Bruiser Brody was the man he was. He did it for his family. There are many tributes to Bruiser Brody across the entirety of the wrestling world, and perhaps none more so than in All Japan. The July 19th show at Korakuen Hall, the first following Brody's passing, features the wrestlers gathered around the ring as Bubba holds his picture for the traditional 10-bell salute, as well as Stan Hansen leading the crowd in a chant for Brody following his victory over Isao Takagi. The proposed August 29th, 1988 show becomes a memorial for Bruiser Brody, and the celebration of him is enough for All Japan to produce their biggest Budokan card in a decade. There isn't a seat left in the house as over 16,000 people attend the show, with the majority of the profits, around $70,000, going to Bruiser Brody's family. Brody's place in the dream match that would have happened on this night is filled by Abdullah the Butcher, who has a typically violent and schmoz-tastic bout against the Lariat. It's short, it's nasty, it features involvement from Jimmy Snuka, and eventually ends with a thoroughly messy finish that is basically a no contest. Not the greatest wrestling match ever, but a very fitting one indeed. Alongside a cracking main event tag bout between Revolution and Olympics that sees Tenryu and Haru reclaim their tag belts, having lost them to Tsuruta and Yatsu a couple of months previously, the card is filled with legendary names and new talents. All 4 future pillars are on this event, as well as old-timers like Giant Bubba, Rusha Kimura, Goro Surumi, Hiroshi Wajima and Haruka Aigen. And of course, there is the memorial shrine to Brody himself, the entirety of All Japan's wrestlers and staff coming out to lay their flowers. There's the extended moment between Snuka and Brody's memorial, and then the appearance of Barbara Goodish, Brody's widow, and his son Jeffrey Dean. Barbara takes Brody's picture to the ring for the 10-bell salute, and later gifts Stan Hansen with Brody's chain, wishing that it brings him good luck for the future. It is powerful, emotional stuff, a very worthy tribute. One that is led off with an appropriate message to the late, great man. To Bruiser Brody, peace be with you. Bye for now.